Hello dear friends. The topic of today's video is the memories of Finnish soldiers about the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939–1940s. It was a war in very harsh conditions. There are certain disputes about the reasons for the war with Finland. I will not talk much here on this topic, but I will quote Joseph Stalin at a meeting of the commanding staff, which was held on April 17, 1940. Did the government and the party act correctly in declaring war on Finland? This question specifically concerns the Red Army. Could the war have been avoided? It seems to me that it was impossible. It was impossible to do without war. The war was necessary, since peace negotiations with Finland did not produce results, and the security of Leningrad had to be ensured, of course, because its security is the security of our fatherland. Not only because Leningrad represents 35% of the defense industry of our country and, therefore, the fate of our country depends on the integrity and safety of Leningrad, but also because Leningrad is the second capital of our country. Stalin was afraid that Leningrad would be captured in the early days of the impending war with Germany. He had no idea what stubborn resistance this small but very brave country would have. Do not forget to rate the video and leave your opinion in the comments. Well, we are starting. Corporal Toivo Ahala, 3rd Company, 15th Infantry Regiment. It was Sunday, December 17, 1939. Already at 7 in the morning, the enemy's artillery fire increased to unprecedented intensity. The offensive was to begin on both sides of the road from Kokjärvi along an almost treeless sandy field. The view of the battlefield from our positions was quite good, at least 500 meters. In front of our positions there were still fairly complete barbed wire barriers and anti-tank gouges. Artillery shelling of our positions was moved in depth and the entire might of the armed forces of the Soviet Union fell upon our positions. The games were over, everything was serious. About 50 tanks marched on a half-kilometer front, of which the largest were 8 meters long, 3 wide, and 3 high. They moved fairly quickly across a flat field and fired continuously from cannons and machine guns, despite the fact that their fire on the move was inaccurate. A huge number of infantry followed the tanks in several echelons. Although the ground was already covered with snow, the Russians did not yet have white cloaks. For us, this was a clear advantage, it was very clear where to aim. Our artillery fired several volleys at the mass advancing on us, but in order to achieve at least some effect, it was necessary to fire 10 times as many shells. Our anti-tank guns were able to put to sleep several tanks in the neutral zone. Some tank was blown up by a mine. The bravest tankers crossed the trenches and headed to our rear. Other tanks began purposefully leveling the barbed wire barriers with the ground, others stopped and began to make passages in the gouges. The tanks that went behind us were at a disadvantage, and our tank hunters immediately attacked them. From the tank, close visibility is rather poor, and a brave soldier hiding in a funnel or cell with an anti-tank grenade or a Molotov cocktail is a dangerous enemy for a tank. By evening, from the neutral zone, the screams and groans of the wounded began to be heard, among which one could clearly hear, "Comrade orderly." A couple of tanks that broke through to our rear managed to return to their positions. The commander of the 3rd platoon of our company, Fenrik Malulja, was killed in battle. At least 6 of those whom I know were killed with him. There were about 15 wounded in our company. Lieutenant Oiwa Porras. On the morning of the day the battle began, which took place on December 17, 1939, we were all in pillboxes and trenches, waiting for a possible attack. The enemy artillery fired quite heavily. Heavy shells flew over our heads and, by sound, exploded somewhere in the command area bunker and second line of defense. Smaller caliber shells rained down on our positions. By the sound it was easy to determine where the projectile would fall. At the sound of an approaching shell, everyone fell to the bottom of the trench. The enemy shelled vast areas. To our left, in the stronghold of the lieutenant's company, shell explosions were heard. The same cannonade was heard from the side of the village, Suma. In the strong point of our company there was a strong point of Lieutenant Hartkill and directly next to him a strong point of Marty. In the center of our stronghold was the Miljoni bunker, a machine gun bunker with an underground shelter. In front of this bunker was the Fenrik stronghold, and in front of its positions there was a military outpost. On the extreme right flank, on the shore of the lake, Jussi Katunen held the defense with his platoon. The strongholds of the platoons of Harkila and Kelly were located on a sandy field overgrown with heather, in the most tank-accessible terrain. Therefore, an anti-tank obstacle made of stones was built in front of these strongholds. For the anti-tank defense of this entire area, only one anti-tank gun was enough, which stood behind the wall of the Miljoni and held the entire area at gunpoint. The terrain in front of other strongholds was difficult, partly marshy. We constantly watched the terrain in front of our positions. It was still so dark that the barriers in front of our positions were still barely visible. Here and there we illuminated the area with flares. In the distance, flashes of enemy artillery fire were visible. The shelling of our positions intensified. The bittersweet smell of rupture spread everywhere. The snow around our positions and in the rear was ground into a muddy mass. Only in the direction of the enemy the snow remained white. I met Harkila at his stronghold. He reported that the noise of working tank engines and the clanging of caterpillars had been heard from the enemy all night. Apparently they've been warming up their engines all night in preparation for this morning. The situation seems to have developed exactly according to the charter. Last night in many places they carried out reconnaissance in force. In the Fenrik forward guard area, the firefight lasted half the night. Now the preparations have begun. It is obvious that after this the offensive will begin in the morning along the routes pierced by enemy tanks. The task of the enemy was to sweep us out of the way with one blow and continue the offensive into the hinterland of Finland. Our waiting became more and more nervous as time went by. I continued to walk around the positions with my contact. Along the trenches we came to the stronghold of Kelly's platoon. I stumbled upon him in the trench, gazing with a bitter expression at the columns of smoke rising from the woods from the burning houses of Suma village. "We're going to have a hard day today," he predicted. I agreed with his opinion. "Our positions today will crush the masses of enemy tanks," his trump card. "Even if we are lucky, we will not be able to stop a large-scale tank attack with one anti-tank gun. It is also difficult to stop tanks with anti-tank grenades and Molotov cocktails in open areas during daylight hours. Our only way to stop the enemy is to cut off the enemy infantry from the tanks and force them to turn back. Without infantry support, tanks will not be able to hold the captured area." I went to the Miljon and spoke with the commander of the bullet company, Lieutenant Kinnunen, and the artillery observer of the fortification, Lieutenant Arn. Hastily mounted machine guns were ready for battle. Soldiers stuffed additional machine gun belts. As soon as it finally dawned, the offensive began. The first two heavy tanks of the enemy crawled out of the forest in front of us. Behind them, 3 more crawled out in a row, and another, they lined up next to each other in the open area. They began to approach at low speed, engines roaring and tracks clanging. 12 tanks went to the stronghold of the Harkila platoon, firing from cannons on the move. Infantry marched under the protection of tanks. The infantry marched along the entire front of our visibility. In chain and groups, often one after another, enemy infantry came at us knee-deep in snow. Among the shooters were visible machine gun crews and carriers carrying boxes of ammunition. More tanks followed the infantry. The thought flashed through my mind that everything would be decided within the next hour and that many of us would no longer see the white light. Hurricane fire was opened from all positions. The machine guns of the Bmiliani joined the fire. Our artillery opened fire. Explosions of shells were visible in the attacking chains of the enemy. Part of the attackers rushed to the ground, hiding from the fire. Part continued to make their way through the snow with a loud battle cry. After a couple of 100 meters, the enemy fell into the sector of fire of our machine guns. The attack faltered. It was evident that many enemy soldiers began to build snow parapets for protection, and some tried to dig in the frozen ground. The enemy tanks, marching at the point of impact, and the infantry following closely behind them, reached the line of gouges. Tanks easily crossed over the gouges. They marched in tight formation through the barbed wire fence. Many tanks crossed our trenches and headed to the rear. And then the Russians gave us a surprise. 2 tanks deployed along our trenches and began to water the stronghold of the Hartkill platoon with flamethrowers. They unleashed a shower of fire and thick smoke on the soldiers in the trenches. I went to the position of Junior Sergeant Rintel's anti-tank guns, and already at the position I realized that the flamethrower tanks could not be knocked out from it. Tanks that had passed the gouges began to enter our sector of fire. The gun fired. A shell hitting the turret of one of the tanks was clearly visible. The tank turned left and stopped. Charge, aim, fire. Hit in the second tank, he stopped. A second after the hit, the turret hatch on the tank opened, and hands and a head in a leather helmet appeared from there. At the same moment, the tank was engulfed in flames, the ammunition detonated, and the tank burned down. Flamethrower tanks continued to fight. One of them walked along the communication route and drove up to the Harkila dugout. The second was already storming Kelly's stronghold. Sometimes the combustible mixture that the tank threw did not ignite, and the tank's target remained simply filled with fuel oil. After a moment, this tank headed through our trenches to the dugouts. At the same time, our anti-tank gun destroyed 2 more tanks in front of the Kelly stronghold. The machine guns of the Bmiliani fired continuously. We also fired intensely from our trenches. The enemy infantry tried to move forward, ignoring the losses. In front of us on the ground there were already many motionless black bumps. The enemy tried to support the advancing guns put forward for direct fire. They were shelling our firing points. Here and there shells burst on the parapet. Immediately, as soon as the flash of the shot was visible, the projectile was already exploding at the target. This projectile covered 2 messengers. I don't think they even realized what happened. About noon I received a report that Harkila had been wounded and his assistant had been killed. The messenger also reported that there were already many dead and wounded. They could not be evacuated, since the enemy tanks were among our positions. 1 tank was on the roof of the Harkila dugout, and many more tanks crawled back and forth near the road and in the rear. Some of our positions were captured by the enemy. The situation began to deteriorate rapidly. We were not able to recapture the part of the stronghold captured by the enemy, despite the fact that we stormed it many times. In one such attempt, Fenric was killed. Malulia, who led the attack and advanced 20 meters ahead. Tanks with their fire stopped our attacks at the very beginning. At least we managed to contain the enemy, and we did not allow him to widen the gap. The enemy also did not have the strength to advance further. Kelly had a breather to reorganize the men of Harkil's platoon and gain a foothold in their positions. The soldiers stubbornly held their positions and remained in the trenches. Sometimes they had to retreat in front of the enemy tanks from the trenches during the communications. Although we all saw flame-throwing tanks for the first time, and their frightening streams of fire smoked and burned the white camouflage suits of many soldiers, there was no panic. Everyone understood that the trenches gave us the best cover from enemy fire and it was better to fight in them. With the onset of darkness, we recaptured the lost section of our trench. To our surprise, this time the resistance was much weaker than during the day. First, we fired a burst from the machine gun, then hand grenades flew at the enemy, and after that we easily moved forward. The trenches left to us by the enemy soldiers were filled up, and we saw how the tank crews left their vehicles. Obviously, they retreated in great haste, as they left a large amount of various equipment and weapons. We immediately emptied many of the abandoned tanks. We did not get to the tank that had been knocked out in front of our barriers. Although the tank was hit, the enemy used it as a firing point. Only a couple of days later it was destroyed. The battle lasted about 20 minutes and required a lot of both physical and psychological stress from us. After the battle, those who were not on patrol went to the dugout to sleep. Some studied the captured trophies with great interest. In one of the dugouts, someone had already dragged a searchlight and a battery from a wrecked tank and adjusted the lighting. Even some kind of trade in insignia of opponents began, but inflation quickly began in this market. Despite the heavy battle during the day, our mood was by no means depressed. The fact that we held the enemy back in our sector gave us self-confidence. I confirmed this to the battalion commander in a long-winded report when he came to us in order to get acquainted with the situation. Toivo Automo, 3rd Battalion of the 13th Infantry Regiment. The anti-tank defense techniques that we were taught in peacetime were not very useful. In the instructions, it was believed that you could stop the tank by putting a crowbar or a log in the undercarriage. One of our soldiers from the 7th Company, Private Vieno from Loima, tried to stop the tank in the area of Lampastanoja too in this way. The scrap with a terrible rattle wrapped around the caterpillar and fell out of the undercarriage without causing any harm to the tank. Then Loimu grabbed a thick log and thrust it into the caterpillar. The log turned into a bunch of toothpicks, which would have been enough for a company, and the tank drove on until it was blown up by a bunch of grenades. The second way to stop an enemy tank, recommended in peacetime instructions, is to shoot from a shotgun point blank at the tank's viewing devices. Some people brought shotguns with them to the front, but I don't think anyone at the front used them like that. At the beginning of the war, we received new brief instructions for fighting tanks. In general, it was written in the manual that tanks should not be afraid. It was also recommended to remove road signs from the forks so that the enemy tanks that had broken through would get lost in our rear. That's all for today. Do you think Finnish soldiers have more honest and frank memories than German soldiers? Don't forget to rate the video and subscribe. Bye everyone, see you soon.